Don't bring up the airplane thing at dinner tonight. People find it embarrassing. My brother-in-law said it over his shoulder, not bothering to turn around, his hands still arraying brisket on a platter for the guests. My sister Patricia's serving fork stopped in midair. The whole back corner of the patio went quiet, the kind of quiet that sounds like a latch clicking shut from the outside. 40 guests, on that wide mountain porch, suddenly remembered the sweet tea in their hands. For 26 years, my whole family believed I pushed paper for some office in the government. They had no idea that the man about to walk through that cedar gate had once stood at attention in front of me in a desert half a world away. I wish I could tell you that moment felt good. It didn't. I just felt tired. The kind of tired a night's sleep doesn't fix. I looked down at my left hand, the knuckles gone stiff again, the way they always do when the weather is about to turn. 17 sets earlier, I'd been sitting in my truck out on the road, half a second from driving home. But to understand why my own sister couldn't meet my eyes that night, you have to go back 3 years. To the afternoon I realized I'd missing the sign sitting right in front of me. It started with a phone bill. My name is Margaret Calloway, though everybody who's known me longer than 10 minutes calls me Maggie. I was 57 that spring, newly retired, living alone in a rented house outside Asheville, North Carolina, with a view of the Blue Ridge that I paid too much for and never once regretted. I'd spent 31 years in the Air Force. Most of those years, my family thought I worked in logistics, which, technically, was true. I was very good at moving things from one place to another. I just never explained that sometimes those things were people, and sometimes the places were the kind you don't put on a postcard. I'd learned a long time ago that there's no point trying to explain a classified career to relatives at a church potluck. They'd already decided who I was. Easier to let them keep their version. It started early, that version of me. I was the serious one, our mother used to say, the one who watched. Patricia got the looks and the lightness and the boys lined up at the door, and I got the report cards and the silences. When our father came home from the furniture plant smelling of sawdust and Marlboros, it was Patricia he wanted to hear sing, and it was me. He handed the broken lamp and the screwdriver and said, "You'll figure it out." I always did. That was the whole arrangement of my childhood in one sentence. Patricia gets sung to. Maggie figures it out. I don't say that with any bitterness. It's just the truth of the family I came from, and you can't understand the rest of this without it. I learned young that being capable was a thing people leaned on but didn't celebrate. You don't throw a party for the daughter who fixes the lamp. You just hand her the next broken thing. So when I joined up at 19, my father shook my hand like I'd told him I'd taken a job at the bank. "Good steady work," he said. He never once asked what I actually did, not in 31 years. Not even when I made rank, not even when I came home with a folded flag from a funeral he'd never hear the details of. He'd ask Patricia about her Azelis for an hour, and then turn to me and say, "You still doing the office work then?" And I'd say, "Yes, Dad, the office work." Because the truth was classified, and because, somewhere under the classification, I think I'd stopped expecting him to want it. That's the wound if you're looking for it. Not the money, not Gerald, not any of what came later. The wound was always the same one. I spent a whole life being the one who could be relied on and never once being the one who got asked. And I'd be lying if I told you it didn't leave a mark on how I read every room I walked into for the rest of my life, including, eventually, my sister's kitchen. The morning everything started, I was at Patricia's kitchen table in Hendersonville, helping her sort a shoebox of receipts, because her eyes weren't what they used to be. She was 62 then, 2 years older than me, but she'd always seemed younger, lighter somehow, the pretty one, the one who got married first. She married Gerald Voss back in the 80s, 40 years, that coming fall. She handed me a stack of mail to open while she made coffee, and one envelope caught on my thumb. A phone bill, past due. Final notice in red. "Pat, did you know your cell's about to get cut off?" She came over fast, too fast, and took it out of my hand. "Oh, that's nothing. Gerald handles all that. I'll tell him. It says final notice, he handles it." She said it the way you'd shoo a fly. Then she smiled, but the smile didn't reach anywhere. "You want the hazelnut creamer or the regular?" I let it go. That's the thing I keep coming back to, even now. I let it go. We drank our coffee and talked about her grandkids and a casserole recipe and whether the dogwoods were early that year. Ordinary things. A normal Tuesday. But somewhere in the back of my head, a small light came on. The same one that used to come on overseas when a checkpoint was too quiet or a road was too empty. You learn to notice when the picture is missing a piece. You don't always know what the piece is yet. You just know it's gone. The thermostat in her kitchen was set to 64. In April, in the mountains. Patricia had her cardigan buttoned to the throat. Gerald, she explained when I mentioned it, liked to keep the heating bill down. Gerald liked a lot of things kept down, it turned out. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make Gerald into a cartoon, and he wasn't one. He was charming, in the way that works on strangers and wears thin on the people who live with him. He'd been a real estate man for 30 years, sold lake houses and mountain cabins to retirees from Florida, and he had the handshake and the laugh and the golf shirts to prove it. He coached Little League once. He grilled a good steak. At parties he'd put his arm around Patricia and call her my bride. And people thought it was sweet. I thought it was sweet too, for a long time. That's the part that's hard to admit. I'm supposed to be the one who notices things. And I'd been so busy noticing them in deserts and airfields and other people's countries that I'd stopped noticing them in my own sister's kitchen. That spring I started paying attention, the way I used to get paid to pay attention. It wasn't one big thing. It never is. It was 100 small ones, and the small ones are what make people doubt themselves, which is exactly the point of them. Patricia had stopped going to her Thursday quilting group. When I asked, she said she'd lost interest. But Carol from the group ran into me at the Ingalls on Highway 64 and said she missed Pat. Said Pat had told them Gerald thought the drive was a waste of gas. Patricia asked permission to buy things. I watched her do it. $22 for a sweater she'd been eyeing, and she texted Gerald first, and waited, and only bought it after he wrote back. A grown woman 62 years old, asking a man if she could spend $22 of what I later learned was her own inheritance. She flinched when his truck pulled in the driveway. A small flinch. Just the shoulders. The kind you'd miss if you weren't built to catch it.
And there was the money. There's always the money.
Gerald had consolidated their accounts a few years back, after Pat got a little forgetful with the checkbook, he said. He'd taken her debit card to help. He read her texts, he said, because she got phishing scams and he was protecting her. Every cage I've ever seen gets built the same way. Bar by bar, and every bar painted to look like a kindness. By the middle of May, I'd seen enough to know what I was looking at. I just didn't have a name for it yet. That wasn't the name nobody wants to say out loud about their own family. The name, it turned out, was financial exploitation, elder abuse. I'd learned the legal definitions soon enough, sitting in an attorney's office with a yellow legal pad, feeling like the slowest student in a class I should have aced. The afternoon it cracked open, Gerald was out golfing. Patricia and I were on her back porch shelling peas, and the ceiling fan was ticking overhead like it was counting something down, and she just got quiet in a way she hadn't before. "Maggie," she said, looking at the peas, not at me. "Can I ask you something and you won't make it a whole thing?" "You can ask me anything. If I wanted to look at the bank statements." "Ours. Could I do that on my own?" "Without Gerald. I set down the bowl." "It's your account, Pat. You can do whatever you want." She laughed, but there was no air in it. "That's the thing. I don't think it is anymore. My name's not on some of it." He said it was simpler that way for the taxes. I kept my voice level. The way you do when a thing matters too much to let your voice show it. "When did he take your name off?" "I don't know. I signed some papers. He brings me papers." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, just full. "I sign what he puts in front of me. I always have. He gets so tired explaining things." "Pat, has he ever scared you?" The fan ticked. Somewhere down the road a lawnmower started up. She didn't answer for a long time, and the not answering was the answer. "He's never hit me," she finally said. Which is its own kind of sentence. It's the sentence women say when they've spent years deciding that what's happening to them doesn't count, because it didn't leave a mark you can photograph. "Okay," I said. "Okay," I didn't lecture her. I wanted to. Everything in me wanted to drive to that golf course and find Gerald and have a very short conversation, but I'd learned something in 31 years that civilians sometimes never learn. The loud move and the right move are almost never the same move. The loud move feels good for about 90 seconds. The right move takes patience you can taste. So I asked her one question instead. If there was a way to find out exactly what's going on with your money, quietly, legally, no drama, No police kicking in doors. Would you want to know? She thought about it for what felt like a year. Yes, she said. I think I'd want to know. That was the door cracking open. Just a crack. But I've gotten armies through smaller gaps than that. What I didn't know yet was how much was on the other side of it. I made 3 phone calls over the next week, and I made them from my own porch, with the door closed, in the late evening when the mountains turn that deep ink blue and the whole valley goes still. The first call was to an elder law attorney in Asheville named Ruth Delacroix. She'd been a prosecutor before she went private, and she had a voice like a dry county road. No patience, all gravel. I told her the situation in plain terms. She listened without interrupting, which I respected, and at the end she said one thing that stayed with me. Mrs. Calloway, the hardest part of these cases isn't the proof. It's that the victim usually defends the person doing it, right up until the end, sometimes past it. Is your sister ready to stop defending him? Not yet, I said. But she's tired of being afraid. That'll do, Ruth said. Tired is where it starts. The second call was to an old friend named Daniel Okafor, who I'd served with 2 deployments and who now worked in fraud compliance for a regional bank out of Charlotte. Danny didn't ask why. He just asked for the names and the rough timeline, and he told me to be patient, that this kind of thing leaves a trail and the trail doesn't go anywhere. The third call was the one that took the longest, because I sat with the phone in my hand for 20 minutes before I dialed. Adult Protective Services. Buncombe County. A woman named Renata answered, and she had the calmest voice I'd heard in years, and she asked me a series of careful questions while I watched a barn owl cross the valley below my porch. Was my sister mentally competent? Yes, sharper than me on a crossword. Was there physical violence? Not that I could prove. Was there financial control? Yes, all of it. Did my sister want help? Long pause, the hardest question. Yes, I finally said. She does. She just doesn't have the words for it yet. Renata told me how it would work. Slow, methodical, no drama. Exactly the way I wanted it. She explained that if I came in like a bulldozer, Gerald would feel cornered, and a cornered man destroys records and turns his wife into the unreliable one, the forgetful one, the one nobody should listen to. She said the worst thing I could do was let him know I was looking. So I didn't. For the rest of that spring and into the summer, I did the hardest thing I know how to do, which is wait while someone I love stays in a bad place. I'd drive out to Hendersonville twice a week. I'd help Patricia with little things. And quietly, slowly, we built a record. Not in a way that would tip Gerald off. We changed her phone passcode while he was at the driving range. We started a notebook of dates. The Thanksgiving he'd taken her car keys, the Easter she'd had to ask her own daughter for $40, the week the water heater broke, and he'd screamed at her for an hour about the cost while she stood in 2 inches of cold water in the basement. Real life doesn't come with clean dates. Half of it was sometime after Memorial Day and the week the Hendersons' barn burned. But it was hers, and it was real, and writing it down did something to her. Every entry was a small brick removed from the wall he'd built around her. By July, she was sitting up straighter. By August, she'd started going back to the quilting group. That's when Gerald started to notice the temperature change in his own house. He didn't know what it was, he just knew Patricia was different. Answering back a little, lingering a little longer when she went out. And men like Gerald, when they feel control slipping, they don't always grab harder right away. Sometimes they get quiet and watchful, and that's worse, because you can see them recalculating. One morning in late August I came by early, and found him in the kitchen at 6 a.m., in his undershirt, going through a drawer of Patricia's, fast and careful. The way you go through something when you're looking for a thing you don't want anyone to know you lost. He had her checkbook in his hand. Couldn't sleep? I asked from the doorway. He didn't even flinch. That's how confident he was. Looking for stamps, he said, and put the checkbook back, and smiled at me with all his teeth. You're here early, Maggie. Pat know you're coming by this much? She likes the company. Sure she does. He poured himself coffee and didn't offer me any. You know, it's a funny thing. Woman your age, no husband, no kids, spending all your time at your sister's house. He let it sit there. People might start to wonder if you've got a little too much time on your hands, or a little too much interest in things that aren't yours. There it was, the first real shot across the bow. He was telling me he'd noticed, and he was telling me to back off, and he was doing it with a smile so he could call it a joke if I objected. I've got all the time in the world, Gerald, I said. Retirement's nice that way. Must be. He sipped his coffee. What is it you did again? Some kind of office work for the government, Pat says. Filing paperwork. He shook his head, a little laugh in his throat. All those years in uniform to do what my niece does at the DMV. I'd heard worse than that. From people who meant it more. But it's a funny thing about an insult. It lands different when you know exactly how wrong it is, and you've chosen not to correct it. There's a power in that. The power of a card not played. He thought he was looking at a retired clerk. He had no idea he was talking to someone who'd briefed 3-star generals on missions. He'd have nightmares about, if he had the imagination for nightmares, which I doubted. Something like that, I said. It wasn't the first time he'd done it, and it wouldn't be the last. Over those months, Gerald developed a little routine around me, the way a man develops a callus. At a 4th of July cookout, he introduced me to his golf buddies as Pat's sister. She did some kind of desk thing for Uncle Sam. Never married, you know how it is. How it is. 2 words doing the work of a whole sneer. At a church supper in August, he stood up to say grace and thanked God for the providers and the protectors of this family, and looked right at himself, and not once at me, and Patricia stared at her green beans. The strange thing was, the colder he got, the warmer everyone else seemed to get, and that warmth hurt worse than his cold ever did. Patricia's neighbor, a widow named Glenda who'd buried 2 husbands and didn't take guff from anyone, started saving me the corner seat at every gathering and feeding me pie and actually asking, about my life. You've seen things, she'd say, patting my hand. I can tell. You've got the eyes of somebody who's seen things. She didn't know the half of it, and she was righter than my own father ever managed to be in 31 years. That's the cruelty of it. A stranger with a pie plate saw me clearer than the men whose name I shared. There was a young man at that cookout, too, a great-nephew, maybe 19, just shipped home from basic. He found me by the cooler and got quiet and shy and said, "Aunt Maggie, somebody told me you were in, for real in." Not, he glanced at Gerald, not what he says. And I said, "Son, I was in." And his whole face changed, and he stood up a little straighter, and we talked about nothing and everything for 20 minutes, and across the yard I could feel Gerald watching us, not liking it, recalculating. A man who builds his whole self out of being the biggest deal in the room cannot stand to watch the room turn its head, even an inch, even toward a woman doing paperwork. I filed that away too, not as a weapon, just as information. The way you note where the exits are, right. He set down his mug. Do me a favor and don't fill Pat's head with ideas. She gets confused. Doctors even said so. She needs stability, not. He waved a hand at me, the whole of me, whatever this is. The doctor had said no such thing. I knew because I'd been in the room. But that's how it works. You say a lie like that enough times, in front of enough people, and one day the lie has a life of its own, and the person it's about starts to wonder if it's true. He wasn't just controlling her money. He was building a case that she was losing her mind, so that when she finally said something, no one would believe her. I'd seen disinformation campaigns run by people with budgets and training. Gerald was running one out of a kitchen in Hendersonville with nothing but a mean streak and a wedding photo on the wall, and it was working just as well. Not for much longer. It was Daniel who found the thing that turned a sad situation into a criminal one. He called me on a Sunday evening in early September. I was on the porch. The light was doing that thing it does in the mountains in September, gold going to rust, and I almost didn't answer because I was watching it. "Maggie," he said, "you sitting down?" "I'm always sitting down now, I'm retired." He didn't laugh. "Your brother-in-law's name came up connected to 2 complaints in Henderson and Polk counties. Older women, both widows. Both lost money on something he sold them. A property flipping investment fund. Passive income for retirees, that kind of pitch." The gold light went a little colder. "How much?" "One of them, almost 40,000. The other, more. Neither one filed criminally. They were too embarrassed, but the bank flagged the pattern, and Maggie." He paused. "There's a deed transfer on a property your sister owns. A cabin. Lake Lure. My father bought that cabin, 1986. He worked 22 years at a furniture plant in Drexel, and he saved every spare dollar, and he bought a little place on Lake Lure with a dock that always needed work, and a kitchen that smelled like coffee and pine no matter what you did. I learned to fish off that dock. Patricia got married in the yard. After Dad died, he left it to Patricia, because she was the one who loved it most, and there was never 1 ounce of fight between us about it. I had the Air Force. She had the lake. That was right. What about the cabin? I said. There's a refinance. Recent. Pulls about $160,000 in equity out of it. Your sister's signature's on it. A pause. It doesn't match her other signatures, Maggie. Not the loops, not the pressure. I've looked at a lot of these. I'd put money on it being forged. I sat very still. Below me the valley went dark, the way it does all at once in the mountains, like a hand passing over. Send me everything, I said. Everything you can legally send. Already did. Check your email. And Maggie, his voice changed, dropped, the way it used to before we went outside the wire. This is past APS now. This is district attorney territory. You need Ruth on this Monday morning. I know. And you need to not say one word to him. Not one. Because the second he knows, that cabin's leveraged to the hilt, and the money's gone, and it's your sister's word against his, and you know whose word a jury believes between a charming real estate man and a forgetful old woman. I know that too, I said. And I did. I'd spent a career knowing that. The truth doesn't win because it's true. The truth wins because somebody builds the case patiently and refuses to fire early. I just never had to do it to family. I opened my laptop on the porch and read the documents in the dark, the screen the only light, moths bumping against it. The forged signature. The widows. The fund that didn't exist. The casino withdrawals, because of course there were casino withdrawals, there always are. He'd been driving over the Tennessee line to the boats on the river, and feeding Patricia's father's money into them $1,000 at a time. I thought about my dad on that dock. I thought about Patricia in her buttoned cardigan, in a 64-degree kitchen, asking permission to buy a sweater with money this man had already stolen. And I made myself do the hardest thing in the whole story, which was nothing. Nothing yet. I closed the laptop and I went to bed and I let him keep believing he was the smartest man in any room he walked into. Because that belief was the rope. And I'd learned a long time ago to let a man keep walking until he reaches the end of his own rope. I did not have to wait long, because Gerald, like a lot of men who get away with things, couldn't resist an audience. And he'd already planned the perfect one. The 40th anniversary party. Patricia hadn't wanted it, Gerald insisted. 40 years was a milestone, he said, and a man should celebrate his marriage. And what he meant was a man should be celebrated, in public, by everyone, as the good husband, the family man, the pillar. He rented a big house up off the parkway with a porch that looked out over 3 counties of Blue Ridge, and he invited everyone, cousins, golf buddies, the pastor, the neighbors, his business contacts. 60 people, a caterer, a bartender. A man hired just to take photographs. He wanted the whole community to watch him be wonderful. I almost didn't go. That's the part I told you at the beginning. I sat in my truck on the road outside that rented house for 17 minutes, with the engine running, because I knew what I was carrying and I knew what was coming, and there's a difference between knowing a thing has to happen and wanting to be the one standing there when it does. But Patricia had asked me to come. I don't want to do it without you in the room, she'd said, and that was the whole reason, the only reason, and it was enough. So I turned off the engine. I checked my left hand, the knuckles already stiffening because the weather was turning, and I walked up to the house. The party was already loud when I got there. String lights, a country station playing low, citronella candles, the smell of brisket and wood smoke hanging in the cooling air. Gerald was holding court by the grill in a navy polo, telling a story with his hands, and a half circle of guests was laughing at exactly the right moments. He saw me and his face did a small thing. A flicker there and gone. Maggie made it, he announced to the porch, big and warm. My sister-in-law, the mystery woman. Government work, very hush-hush. He winked at his audience. We think she's a spy. Probably just files things, though. A few people laughed. I smiled and took a sweet tea from the bartender, a kid who couldn't have been 23, and I found Patricia by the railing. She had on a blue dress and too much makeup and the brightest, most frightened smile I'd ever seen on a human face. You came, she whispered. I came. She gripped my arm. Maggie, whatever happens tonight. Pat. I put my hand over hers. Nothing's going to happen tonight that isn't supposed to. I didn't tell her what I knew. Ruth had been clear. The fewer people who knew the timing, the cleaner it would be. There were things in motion that even I couldn't fully control anymore. Papers filed, a process started, and I had let go of the wheel in a way that doesn't come natural to me. I just had to trust that I'd aimed it right. Then Gerald said the thing about the airplane. I'd been telling a story A small one, harmless. About a flight I'd been on once where the heater failed at altitude, and the whole crew put on every layer they had and laughed about it. An old aunt had asked me a question, and I'd answered it. That's all. And from across the patio, not even turning around, arranging brisket on a platter, Gerald said it. Don't bring up the airplane thing at dinner tonight. People find it embarrassing. And the porch went quiet, and Patricia's fork stopped in the air, and 40 people remembered their sweet tea. I want to tell you I had a perfect line ready. I didn't. I just looked at him, and I felt that old cold settle in, the cold that comes instead of heat when something matters too much, and I said the only thing that was true. I'll keep it to myself, I said. I'm good at that. Somebody laughed nervously. Gerald grinned, victorious, and went back to his brisket. He thought he'd won the exchange. He always thought he'd won the exchange, and the terrible patient truth was that the exchange was already over, and had been for weeks, and he just didn't know it yet. That's when the cedar gate opened, and a man I hadn't seen in 11 years walked into the yard. I knew him before I saw his face. I knew him by the way he stood. Some men, even in a golf shirt at a backyard party, carry the posture of every formation they ever stood in, and Thomas Reyes was one of them. He'd been a young captain when I last worked with him, and he was a full colonel now. He'd retired to a place outside Brevard, 20 minutes down the parkway, which I had not known, because the world is small in the mountains, and smaller than that among people who've served. He was, it turned out, the brother of one of Gerald's golf buddies. He'd been invited as a +1. He'd come for the brisket. He had no idea I'd be there. He scanned the porch the way we all do, cataloging exits and faces without thinking about it, and his eyes crossed mine and skipped past and came back and stopped. I watched it happen on his face, the recognition, and then something I hadn't braced for because I'd spent 11 years and a whole second life letting people think I was nobody. His back straightened, his chin came up, the beer in his hand came down to his side, slow, deliberate, set on the railing without a sound. Colonel Calloway, he said. He didn't say it loud. He didn't need to. The porch had already gone quiet for Gerald's little joke, and into that quiet words dropped like a stone into a still pond. Nobody moved. Gerald turned around, brisket tongs still in his hand, the grin still half on his face, not yet understanding. Colonel? He said, with a little laugh, looking for the punchline. Tom, you got the wrong gal. This is Maggie. She does paperwork. He looked around for his audience, for the laugh that always came. Filing. For the government. Thomas Reyes did not laugh. He looked at Gerald the way you look at a man who's just said something obscene at a funeral, and then he looked back at me, and he did the thing I had spent my whole quiet retirement trying never to make anyone do. He came to attention, right there on a backyard porch in his golf shirt, his heels coming together, his hand snapping up to his brow in a salute, as clean and square as anything I ever saw on a flight line. Ma'am, he said, it is an honor. You could have heard a candle gutter. 60 people on that porch, and not one of them breathing. I didn't want it. God help me. I didn't want it, the salute or the silence or the 60 faces swinging from him to me and back. But there are things you can't ungive a man like Thomas Reyes, and respect freely offered is one of them, and so I did the only thing the moment allowed. I came to attention, too, just for a second. Just enough, and I returned it. Stand easy, Colonel, I said quietly. We're at a party. He dropped the salute. But he didn't relax, not all the way. He turned, slowly, to the porch full of staring people, to Gerald frozen at his grill with the tongs hanging from his hand, and he said the thing that took the floor out from under the whole evening. You all need to understand who you're standing next to. His voice wasn't loud. It carried anyway, the way certain voices do. I served under Colonel Margaret Calloway for 2 tours. There are men alive tonight, eating dinner with their families, who would not be alive if not for the decisions this woman made under fire. We did not do paperwork. He looked at Gerald when he said the last part, and his voice went flat and cold. We did not do filing. The bartender had stopped pouring. The photographer had lowered his camera, and Gerald's face was doing a thing I'd been waiting 3 months to see. The grin was gone. The color was going with it. He looked, for the first time in the 40 years I'd known him, like a man who just realized the ground he was standing on wasn't ground. But here's the part that mattered more than the salute. The salute was the spark. It wasn't the fire. Because a salute fades, and a charming man can recover from being embarrassed at a party. He'd have spun it by Monday. Tom always did exaggerate. Maggie never told us what were we supposed to think. He'd have survived a salute. What he could not survive was what came next, and what came next didn't come from me. It came from an old man in a folding chair by the dessert table who I hadn't even noticed. He stood up slowly, the way men stand up when their knees have given them 40 years of grief. He was Gerald's age, maybe older, in a windbreaker and a feed store cap, and his hands shook a little, and his name was Earl Whitcomb, and I'd never met him in my life. Long as we're saying who people really are, Earl said, and his voice cracked, but he kept going. I got something to say too. The quiet got deeper, a different kind of quiet now. My wife Doreen passed 2 years ago, Earl said. He was looking at Gerald, only at Gerald. Before she went, she put $41,000 into an investment this man sold her. Property fund, he called it. Said it'd take care of her after I was gone. His jaw worked. There wasn't no fund. I tried to tell folks. Nobody much wanted to hear it about Gerald Voss. Such a nice man. The last 3 words came out like something spit on the ground. Nobody laughed now. Nobody breathed. And from the back, by the drinks table, a woman's voice said, "He did the same to my mother." And somebody else, quieter, "And my aunt." I hadn't arranged that. I want to be clear about that, because it would make a better story if I had, and it'd be a lie. I'd reported what I knew to people whose job it was to act on it. But you cannot keep a thing like Gerald's secret forever in a small county, and what I'd learned over a career is that the truth, once it has somewhere safe to land, comes out of the walls. People who'd been ashamed and silent for years looked around that porch and saw that they weren't the only one, and weren't crazy, and weren't alone. And the silence that had protected Gerald for 2 decades broke all at once, the way a dam doesn't crack slowly. It goes all at once or not at all. Gerald set down the tongs. His hands weren't steady. He started, and his voice didn't have the room anymore, and he knew it. "This is a party. My anniversary party. I don't know what Tom thinks he's. And Earl, you old fool, Doreen made her own choices. Don't you say her name?" Earl took a step. His son took his arm, gentle, and Earl stopped, but he didn't sit down. "Don't you ever say her name?" Patricia was standing very still beside me. I felt her hand find mine. And I watched my sister look at the man she'd been afraid of for 10 years, watched her watch him try to talk his way out of a room that had finally stopped listening, and I felt her grip change. Not tighten in fear. Settle. The way your hand settles when you've decided something. Gerald's eyes came to me then. They'd been everywhere else, ricocheting around the porch, and now they landed on me, and they were pleading. And underneath the pleading was the thing I'd been waiting to see. The thing that told me he finally understood the shape of what was happening. "Maggie," he said. "Quiet, just to me. What did you do?" I held his eyes. The porch held its breath. "I didn't do anything, Gerald," I said. "You did all of it. I just stopped covering for it." And then headlights swung across the front of the house. Not police. I want to be honest about how it actually went, because the truth is better than the movie version, even if it's slower. It wasn't a SWAT team. It was a single county car, no lights, no siren, and a woman in a gray blazer who I recognized as Renata from Adult Protective Services. And beside her a younger man with a badge clipped to his belt who turned out to be an investigator from the DA's office. They'd come because Ruth had filed that week, and a forged deed on a property in Rutherford County had moved the matter from a family sadness to a felony, and they'd been planning to interview Gerald Monday morning at his office. They came to the party instead because, as Renata told me later, a neighbor had called about a disturbance. 60 people on a porch, and one of them, somewhere in the back, had quietly dialed the county when Earl started talking, and that's how it goes sometimes. The machinery you built grinds slow and then catches without you touching it. The investigator was polite. That surprised people, I think. They want the drama, the cuffs, the shouting. He just walked up the steps, asked which one was Gerald Voss, and said they'd like him to come answer some questions about a deed transfer on a property at Lake Lure, and some complaints regarding an investment fund. He said it the way you'd ask a man to move his car. Gerald looked around his anniversaries party. At the string lights and the catered brisket and the photographer, and the 60 people he'd invited to watch him be wonderful. And every one of them was watching him, all right, just not the way he'd planned. "This is a misunderstanding," he said to the porch, to all of them, the salesman reaching for the close one last time. "Patricia, Pat, tell them I take care of you." The whole porch turned to my sister. Patricia let go of my hand. She stepped forward, just a little, into the space between Gerald and everybody, and she stood up straight in her blue dress and she looked at him for a long moment. "You took my keys," she said. Her voice shook and held. "You took my card. You took the thermostat and the quilting group and Daddy's cabin." She swallowed. "You took 40 years, Gerald. You're not taking the rest." She turned to the investigator. "My name's on that deed," she said. "I never signed it. I'll tell you whatever you need." I'd imagined a lot of versions of that night over the summer. I'd never imagined that one. I'd thought, if it ever came, that I'd be the one to say it, that she'd need me to. And instead my sister, who'd asked a man's permission to buy a sweater, stood up at her own anniversary party and said it herself, in front of everyone, in a voice that started out frightened and ended up like our father's. That was the moment. Not the salute. The salute just got the room quiet enough for her to finally be heard. They didn't arrest him that night. That's not how it works, and the truth is the slow part. He went in for questioning. There were months of it after. Hearings, statements, a forensic accountant, lawyers charging by the hour to explain things we already knew in our bones. Justice doesn't move at the speed of a porch. It moves at the speed of paper. But it moved. The fall and winter after that party were a long, slow education in how justice actually works, which is to say nothing like television. There was a forensic accountant named Pham who spent 6 weeks reconstructing where Patricia's money had gone. And when she was done, she had a binder 3 inches thick that told a story so Kurt's lawyer, I heard, even Gerald's first hoe, advised him to settle and stop digging. He didn't listen. Men like Gerald never believe the hole is real until they're standing at the bottom of it looking up. The deed was the thing that sank him. A handwriting examiner testified that the signature on the Lake Lure refinance was not Patricia's, that the pressure was wrong and the loops were learned, copied, the work of a man who'd practiced his wife's name on scratch paper. Daniel had been right from the porch in September. The bank had been the one to flag it, and once a bank flags a forgery, it cannot unflag it. And once a forgery is on a deed, it is not a family matter anymore. It is the state's matter. Word went around the county the way word does. The golf buddies got quiet. The church found reasons not to call. The man who'd been hired to take photographs at the anniversary party, it turned out, had kept shooting through the whole thing, and somewhere there exists a photograph of Gerald Voss at his own celebration with the color draining out of his face. And I'm told it got passed around more than he'd have liked. His real estate license came up for review. 2 more women came forward once the first ones did, and then it wasn't 2 or 3, it was a pattern, it was a practice. It was a decade of a charming man selling funds that didn't exist to widows who trusted him because he coached Little League and grilled a good steak. Gerald Voss was charged in spring with multiple counts of obtaining property by false pretenses and 1 count of forgery of a deed. I sat in the back of the courtroom for the arraignment. I didn't have to. Patricia didn't want to go and I didn't push her, but I went and I sat in the back. And I watched a man who'd spent 40 years being the biggest deal in every room he entered stand in front of a judge in a county courthouse and answer to his name in a voice that didn't carry anymore. Earl Whitcomb was there too. We ended up next to each other on the hard wooden bench, 2 old people who'd never met before that porch, and he reached over and patted my hand the way Glenda used to, and he said, "Doreen would have liked knowing it came around." That was all. We didn't talk again. We didn't need to. Gerald Voss was eventually charged with multiple counts of financial exploitation and forgery. Earl Whitcomb testified, so did 2 other women whose names I'd never known. Doreen wasn't his first and Patricia wasn't his last attempt, and that's the thing about men like him. They almost never start with their worst victim, they practice. The casino records came out. The fund that never existed came out. The cabin on Lake Lure stayed in the family because Ruth got the forged transfer frozen before he could pull the money out, and the day she called Patricia to tell her, "My sister cried for an hour, not pretty crying, the real kind, the kind that's been waiting years for permission." But I want to tell you about one more conversation, because the porch was the public part, and there's always a private part, and the private part is where the truth actually lives. It was a few weeks after the party. Before the charges, after the questioning. Gerald asked to meet me. Just me. I think he thought he could fix it with me, that I was the engine of the thing, and if he could talk to the engine, he could stop it. He didn't understand yet that I wasn't the engine. I was just the first person who'd refused to lie for him. We met at a diner off the parkway, the kind with vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never stops. He looked smaller. Men like that always look smaller once the audience is gone. The charm needs a crowd to run on. One-on-one in a booth, with someone who isn't buying it, there's just a tired man in a golf shirt. He'd dressed up for it, I noticed. Pressed shirt, the good watch he could no longer afford. He'd come to negotiate, and he'd worn his negotiating clothes. And that told me he still didn't understand what had happened to him. He thought this was a deal that could be closed. He'd spent his whole life closing deals. You could call them off, he said. If you wanted to, Pat listens to you. There's no calling off the truth, Gerald. Family doesn't do this to family. I looked at him for a while. The waitress refilled our cups and went away. Outside, the first cold rain of the fall was starting, and my left hand ached the way it does. You're right, I said finally. Family doesn't do this to family. You did it first. For 10 years. You just did it quiet, where it didn't leave a mark anyone could photograph. He tried a different angle. They always have another angle. I gave her a good life, 40 years, a house, vacations, a standing in this community. You think she'd have had any of that on her own? Pat was never. He searched for the word, and the word he landed on told me everything about him: capable. She needed managing. I managed her. You managed her, I repeated. Somebody had to. I thought about my father handing me the broken lamp. You'll figure it out. I thought about a whole life of being called capable as a way of being handed more weight, and I thought about my sister being called the opposite as a way of being robbed. And I understood, sitting in that booth, that they were two ends of the same ugly rope. The world tells some women they're so strong they don't need anything, and tells others they're so weak they can't be trusted with their own money. And both lies do the same work. Both lies let somebody else decide what a woman is allowed to carry. Here's what I keep coming back to, I said. You had 40 years, with a woman who'd have walked through fire for you. She sang at our father's funeral. She forgave you things I'd have left you over, and you looked at all of that, and the only thing you saw was a mark. Something to be managed, something to take from. I shook my head slowly. That's not a marriage, Gerald. That's a long con with a wedding ring on it. I kept thinking you'd thank me someday, he said, and for half a second I almost felt the old pull of it, the charm reaching for a handhold. For taking care of her, for all those years you were gone. He leaned in. Where were you, Maggie, all those years? You want to judge me. Fine, but you weren't here. I was here. That one was meant to land, and a younger version of me might have let it. The guilt of the one who left. It's real, that guilt. I'd carried it through 3 time zones and 2 wars. You're right that I was gone, I said, and you're right that you were here. But staying isn't the same as caring for someone, Gerald. You can stay in a place your whole life and spend every single day taking from it. A weed stays in a garden too. We don't thank it for the company. He didn't have anything for that, for once. I know, I said. You found a way to do it that the law took 20 years to catch up to. That's not innocence, that's just patience for the wrong thing. He looked down into his coffee. And there was no break, no tears, no apology, none of the late awakening I might have written if I were inventing this. He just got smaller in the booth, and quieter, and at the end he said, You think you're so much better than me. With your medals. Coming back here to play the hero. I put a 5 on the table for the coffee. I stood up. The rain was coming harder. No, I said. I don't think I'm better than you. I just stopped being afraid of you. Turns out that's all it ever took. I'm sorry nobody figured it out sooner. And I left him there, in the booth with the rain on the window and the bottomless coffee going cold, and I drove out to Lake Lure, to the cabin my father built, where my sister was waiting for me on the dock with 2 cups of coffee, and a quilt around her shoulders and the lake going silver under the October sky. We sat on that dock for a long time and didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed saying. Patricia moved into a small place outside Brevard that winter. Beige siding, a little porch, wind chimes by the door. The first time I visited after the move, I noticed she slept through the night. I don't think people understand how much fear changes a body until they watch it leave one. She took up watercolors. She kept Dad's old thermos on the windowsill at the cabin and never washed the coffee smell out of it. She went to her quilting group every single Thursday and dared the weather to stop her. The recovery wasn't clean, and it wasn't fast. There were nights, that first winter, when she called me at odd hours, not because anything was wrong, just because the quiet of her own house still frightened her a little. The way an open field frightens an animal that's spent its life in a pen. We'd stay on the phone and not say much. Sometimes she'd cry. Once she said, "I keep waiting to feel free, and instead I just feel tired." And I told her that tired was where free starts. That Ruth Delacroix had told me the same thing about her, and Patricia laughed for the first time in a long time, a real one, with air in it. She started painting the lake. Not well at first, then better. By spring she had a whole row of small watercolors of the dock at different hours, the dock our father built, the light changing across the water, and she gave me one for my birthday, and on the back she'd written, in her own unforged hand, the loops all her own again. To Maggie, who came when I called. There's a version of strength that fixes the lamp without being asked, and a version that finally, at 62, asks. I'd spent my whole life respecting the first one. It took my sister to teach me the second one is harder, and braver, and worth more. I framed it. It hangs where I see it every morning. I'm going to tell you the thing I've come to believe, and then I'm going to let you go. For most of my life, I thought strength was the loud thing. The mission, the medal, the salute on the porch. And that night taught me something I'd somehow missed in 31 years of being trained to be strong. The bravest thing that happened on that porch wasn't Tom Reyes coming to attention. It wasn't the investigator on the steps. It wasn't anything I did. It was my sister, 62 years old, scared half to death, saying the words out loud. You took 40 years. You're not taking the rest. Gerald Voss spent a lifetime believing that kindness was weakness, that patience was something you exploit, that a quiet person is a person who'll never fight back. By the time he understood the difference, his wife was already gone, and the little kingdom he'd built was coming apart in his hands, and the only audience left was a cold cup of coffee in an empty booth. I think about all the Patricias out there. The ones in the buttoned cardigans in the too-cold kitchens. The ones asking permission to spend their own money. The ones who've been told so many times that they're confused that they've started to believe it. If there's somebody in your life who's gotten quieter than they used to be, who flinches when a truck pulls in the drive, who's slowly disappeared from the things they used to love, trust the part of you that's noticing. You don't always have to rescue anybody. Sometimes you just have to be the person in the room who refuses to pretend it isn't happening. Sometimes all it takes is one person who stops being afraid, standing close enough that the other one can borrow the courage until they find their own. My left hand still aches when the weather turns. I've stopped minding it. It tells me when the rain is coming, and out here on a dock my father built, with my sister finally sleeping through the night a few miles down the road, knowing when the rain is coming, is a useful thing. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. Because respect, the real kind, the kind you give freely, and the kind you finally demand for yourself, it has a way of finding its way home.